Hello, everyone. I'm John Horrigan, and welcome to Journey Through the Past. In this episode, The Pilgrims, 400 Years After. It's being presented to you by the Southborough Council on Aging, and hello to all of you folks that go to the Southborough Senior Center, and to all of you watching on Southborough Access Media, SAM. Now, folks, the views and opinions expressed are those of the author and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Southborough Council on Aging or Southborough Access Media. Any content that I provide is of my own personal opinion and is not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, individual, or anyone or anything. And when I use the term Indian, I do not mean to use it in a derogatory sense. Native Americans, Indigenous peoples, and First Nation tribes are all interchangeable appellations. This is a text-driven presentation for the benefit of folks who may have difficulty hearing, or if you're a port listener like I am. So any technical issues are on my side, and maybe one day I will be able to present to you live at the Southborough Senior Center. But until then, please stay safe, stay happy, and stay strong. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can reach out to me via email, johnhorrigan@hotmail.com, or follow me on Facebook, J.R. Horrigan, John Horrigan, historian, pro sports announcer. So in this edition, The Pilgrims, 400 Years After. Background to me, I'm a host, writer, and co-creator, and I've won 5 Boston, New England Emmy Awards for a show called The Folklorist. And I was very lucky to receive 20 nominations, 12 Telly Awards, 7 Communicator Awards, and then part of the team out of New TV in Newton, Mass, where The Folklorist was produced. They went back-to-back nationally for Arts and Entertainment in the Alliance of Community Media in 2015 and 2016, but unfortunately the program was canceled. So folks, a Puritan believed that it was necessary to go back to the absolute beginning of Christianity before the church had been corrupted. The only truths were in the Old and New Testament. If it wasn't in the Bible, it was a man-made distortion of what God intended. Even hymns they considered to be a corruption of God's word. And they believed that a congregation began with a covenant between a group of believers and God. And because the identity of saints had already been determined by God, there was nothing a person could do to win salvation. Matthew 18:20, for where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them. Now, Puritans were English Protestants in the 16th and 17th centuries who sought to purify the Church of England of Roman Catholic practices, maintaining that the Church of England had not been fully reformed and should become more Protestant. And since the coronation of King James IV, the first, depending upon who you listen to, in 1603, the pressure to conform to the Church of England was mounting. And the king thought that all Puritans were troublemakers, and they were a threat to his power, and he exclaimed that he would harry them out of the land. Now, the separatists were Puritans who had determined that the Church of England was not a true Church of Christ. In 1607, when the Bishop of York found out about the separatist gatherings, some were imprisoned while others were being watched. And even though the king wanted them out of England, a person would need official permission to voyage to the European continent. So, if the separatists were to sail to Holland to worship how they pleased, they would have to do it in secret. Now, William Bradford grew up in Austerfield in northern Nottinghamshire. He attended religious services in a nearby village called Scrooby. It was here that he met the town's postmaster, William Brewster. And along with other separatists, they listened to the preachings of John Robinson. Now, the separatists' escape from England did not go well, as the first captain that they hired to take them to Holland turned out to be a traitor and a thief who turned them over to the authorities in the Lincolnshire town of Boston. And after several months, they were released from prison and planned yet another escape, securing the services of a trustworthy Dutch captain. But unfortunately, the local militia pursued them to their departure point in Grimsby, and the men hastily sailed, leaving the women and children on the dock. Fortunately, they would rejoin their husbands a few months later in Holland. As they were now considered political dissidents in Holland, they were unprepared for the harsh reality that they would become social outcasts in a foreign country. So John Robinson decided to lead them to the city of Leiden, where they would face limited persecution. Now, William Bradford, after selling his estate in Austerfield, settled into Leiden as a fustian, or a corduroy worker, and he married Dorothy May in 1613. Now, they had a son named John in 1617, whom they would leave behind, and certainly it contributed to Dorothy's depression while she was on board the Mayflower. She fell overboard, some consider it to be suicide, on December 7th, 1620. Now, William Brewster drew the ire of the English when he published, with the help of a 23-year-old named Edward Winslow, a separatist pamphlet that was critical of the king and his Church of England. So he went into hiding as King James put a bounty on his head. Now, early in the 17th century, England realized that its future prosperity relied on the colonization of North America, as Spain, France, and Holland were reaping profits from the fish and fur trade. These European kingdoms had highly developed military, naval, governmental, and entrepreneurial capabilities, and the Spanish and Portuguese centuries-old experience of conquest and colonization during what they called the Reconquista, coupled with new oceanic ship navigation skills, provided the tools, ability, and desire to colonize the New World. So in 1606, King James chartered the Virginia Company with the backing of wealthy merchants in London and Plymouth, England. Now, after attempts to found a colony in modern-day Maine failed, it was known as the Popham Colony, and Jamestown was not returning the wealth that they had anticipated, the king resolved to franchise future settlements by issuing particular patents to those who wished to begin plantations in the New World. And with Brewster still in hiding, John Carver and Robert Cushman took up negotiations with officials in London, and by June 1619 had secured a charter from the Virginia Company. One problem, though: they were broke and could not finance the venture. Then Cushman learned that a group similar to their own, led by a man named Blackwell, left that winter for Virginia with 100 English separatists from Emden, Holland. By the time they arrived in America, 130, including Blackwell himself, were dead, and this gave the Pilgrims pause about their intended journey across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, when the Dutch government learned of their intentions to emigrate, they covertly undermined their attempts to finance an expedition, fearing they would encroach upon their desired location that would become the settlement of New Amsterdam. The Pilgrims then turned to a wealthy English merchant named Thomas Weston and his 70 British business partners. They were known as the Merchant Adventurers. They saw two opportunities: investment and a way to plant their religion in a foreign land. And their charter specified that they could establish a settlement in northern Virginia, which in reality was at the mouth of the Hudson River. Now, Weston proposed that they form a joint stock company, whereby the adventurers would finance the voyage, and in return, the Pilgrims would generate profits through cod fishing and the fur trade. For the next 7 years, the Pilgrims would agree to work 5 days a week for their investors and 2 days a week for themselves, and 1 day's rest on the Sabbath. About 1/3 of the Pilgrims, that's about 125, prepared for the journey west. Then Weston changed the terms of their agreement. Now the Pilgrims must work for the investors for 6 days a week, and Robert Cushman agreed to the new terms without consulting the Pilgrims. Now, the Pilgrims wanted to reach the Hudson River before wintertime, and by June 1620, Weston still had not secured transportation for them. And now Weston insisted adding non-separatists to the expedition. These strangers, as they were called, included a wicked man named Christopher Martin, who would be directing the venture and the future settlement, including the congregation of the Pilgrims. They used Martin as a purchasing agent to procure supplies and provisions for the voyage. Provisions like beer, wine, hardtack, salted beef, salt pork, dried peas, fishing supplies, muskets, armor, clothing, tools, trade goods, seeds, including barley, wheat, peas, and a screwjack that would come in handy even before they reached America. Now, Martin refused to work with John Carver and Robert Cushman, and no one knew where they stood in regard to provisions for the trip. The Pilgrims purchased a 60-ton vessel named the Speedwell, piloted by a man named Reynolds. And by the end of July, the Pilgrims had made their way to Delshaven, where the Speedwell was waiting for them. Now, the plan was for them to rendezvous in Southampton, where the others, with their supposed provisions, along with another ship, would be waiting for them. And it was a sad and mournful parting, according to Bradford, as he left his 3-year-old son behind with Dorothy's parents. Now, the Speedwell, it's about 50 feet in length, had been recently refitted with 2 larger masts to endure the crossing of the Atlantic Ocean. But this modification would eventually make her unseaworthy. Weston had now secured a second vessel called the Mayflower. It was a square-rigged merchant ship with high superstructures that was about 100 feet in length and could carry 180 tons or about 180 casks of wine. Now, the living quarters for the 102 passengers were cramped, with the living area about 80 feet by 20 feet and the ceiling about 5 feet high. And with couples and children packed closely together for a trip lasting 2 months, there was virtually no privacy. When someone became sick, quickly others became ill. And they were suffering from vitamin deficiencies and malnutrition, and they were cold, very cold. Fever and flu struck nearly everyone on board, but strangely, men such as Miles Standish never became ill. Now, the first half of the voyage proceeded over calm seas and under pleasant skies, but then the weather changed, with continuous northeasterly storms hurling themselves against the ship and huge waves constantly crashing against the topside deck. In the midst of one storm, the servant of physician Samuel Fuller died and was buried at sea. A baby was also born, christened Oceanus Hopkins. Now, during another fierce storm, the sails could not be used, and the ship was forced to drift without hoisting its sails for days. The passengers were forced to crouch in semi-darkness below deck as ocean swells rose to over 30 feet. Some say even as high as 50 feet. So with the waves tossing the boat in different directions and the passengers clinging to each other, everyone was soaked to the bone. A storm had so badly damaged its main beam that the crew thought that the ship would sink. But fortunately, they had that metal jack screw that I was telling you about. And that was to be used in the construction of new homes in the settlement, but they used it to secure the beam. And they continued on with their food supplies being nearly depleted. They were low on drinking water, but more importantly, beer. The water was rancid. Beer, even drunk by children, had alcoholic content, and you were less likely to become sick if you imbibed it. So on board, they may have had chickens, sheep, or goats, along with 2 dogs, an English Spaniel and a giant Mastiff. Now, it was piloted by Master Christopher Jones, who had crossed the English Channel with a cargo of wine several times previously, and he had traveled as far as Scandinavia and Greenland. And they called it a sweet ship, as the spilled wine helped tamp down the odor emanating from the bilge. Now, Jones' mate and pilot was Robert Coppin, who had traveled to America previously. And 21-year-old John Alden was the cooper. Now, he was in charge of all casks and barrels on board the ship, almost like a quartermaster. And also on board was Miles Standish, a mercenary designated to be in charge of all military affairs, along with his wife, Rose. Elder William Brewster was joined by his wife, Mary, and their sons, Love and Wrestling. Stephen Hopkins was on the Mayflower as well, along with his pregnant wife, Elizabeth, his son, Giles, and daughters, Constance and Damaris, along with 2 servants, Edward Doty and Edward Lester. Now, he had been to America previously aboard the Sea Venture, which had shipwrecked in Bermuda, and he was charged with mutiny, and that story was the basis for Shakespeare's The Tempest. Edward Winslow was accompanied by his wife, Elizabeth. John Clark was also a co-pilot who had been to America once before, and Giles Healy was the ship's physician. John Carver's wife, Catherine, along with 5 servants, were passengers as well. And the ornery Christopher Martin, who was designated as the Mayflower's governor, traveled with his wife and their servants along with 4 additional families, the Mullinses, the Eatons, and the Billingtons, who Bradford referred to as one of the most profanest families amongst them. Now, Ellen, Jasper, Richard, and Mary Moore were sent on the voyage by their stepfather, Samuel. And John Billington, a drunkard and troublemaker, was joined by his wife, Eleanor, and their sons, John and Francis. Let me talk about those bad neighbors, the Billingtons. They appear in a number of times in the early accounts of the Plymouth colony, and they were reported to be the colony's troublemakers. Francis made squibs and fired a musket in the Mayflower on board while the ship was still anchored off Cape Cod. And now Francis went exploring soon after their arrival, and he was the one that discovered the body of water known as the Billington Sea. And that's where the town brook emanated from. One of the reasons why they chose Plymouth Plantation, known as Patuxent, is because they found this small brook, a freshwater brook known as Town Brook. Now, in March 1621, John Sr. challenged Miles Standish's orders for contempt of the captain's lawful command with several speeches, and he was punished for it. And he would do this many more times. And in May of 1621, John Billington, he was the younger, he became lost in some woods for several days on Cape Cod, eventually being returned home by some natives from the Nauset tribe. And in 1624, John Billington was implicated in the Oldham Lyford scandal, which was a revolt against the rule of the Plymouth Church, but he insisted he was innocent and was never officially punished. And in 1625, Governor Bradford wrote a letter to Robert Cushman saying, "Billington still rails against you. He is a knave, and so will live and die." In 1636, Billington's wife Eleanor was sentenced to sit in the stockade and be whipped for slandering a man by the name of John Doane. And in September of 1630, John Billington Sr. was tried by a jury and hung for the murder of John Newcomen, who he saw as an enemy. This was the first such execution in Plymouth Colony, and Bradford states he was approximately 40 years old at the time of his hanging. So, back to our story. After a disagreement with Thomas Weston, who pulled his financial backing of the voyage and walked off the ship, the Pilgrims were forced to sell some of their provisions, like butter. Martin was now behaving like a despot, cursing all of the Pilgrims at each turn. And because of this, Cushman made sure that he was on the other vessel, the Speedwell. Now, after departing Southampton, the Speedwell became as open and leaky as a sieve. Several days after clearing the Isle of Wight, they had to turn back and head to Dartmouth for repairs. It was now August 17th, 1620, and the ship lay dormant in Dartmouth, awaiting the westerly winds. They had consumed almost half of their provisions, and they weren't even out of the harbor yet. And once they were sailing again, about 200 miles off the British coast, the Speedwell sprang more leaks, and they were forced to turn back to Plymouth, England, and abandon her. The loss of the ship was costly, and maybe Mr. Reynolds had purposely overmasted the ship because he didn't want to go to the New World. Either way, they all crammed onto the Mayflower. So you can see the journey there, the Mayflower and the Speedwell. Starting from the right, the Speedwell left Leiden, joined up in Southampton with the Mayflower. They proceeded to sea and then had to turn into Dartmouth for the repairs in the Speedwell. And then they headed out and had to turn around once again and head back to Plymouth, England, because the Speedwell was not seaworthy. So Cushman left the group, and the remaining passengers crowded on board the Mayflower, 102 in all, which was of which less than 50 were separatists. And on September 6th and 16th, 1620, and you're going to see these dates twice. September 6th is Old Style calendar, Julian calendar. September 16th is the calendar we're on, the Gregorian calendar. Anyways, Bradford described it as a prosperous wind, and the Mayflower departed from Plymouth, England. Now, immediately the passengers became seasick, and they were mocked by a sailor whom Bradford called a proud and very profane young man. And this sailor would curse, and he'd mock the Pilgrims, and he said he couldn't wait until he threw their bodies overboard. But ironically, he would be the first to die at sea, and the Pilgrims took that as a sign from God. Now, during the crossing, as a violent storm lay siege on the Mayflower, a servant by the name of John Howland ventured topside for a breath of fresh air. He was immediately swept off the deck. Somehow, as he fell into the sea, sure to drown, he grabbed a halyard, which is a rope dangling alongside the ship. Despite going 10 to 12 feet underwater, he was pulled aboard with a boat hook and saved. Now, he would go on to marry Elizabeth Tilley, who was considered to be the prettiest on the vessel, and they would go on to marry, have 11 children and 88 grandchildren. And today, their diaspora in line of heritage can account for over 1.5 million people all over the globe in the past 400 years. So the crossing was slow and tedious, and they averaged a speed of about 2 miles per hour, bucking the undiscovered Gulf Stream and the westerly gales. And most of the passengers were now gravely ill, and Christopher Jones, using a map made by explorer John Smith, was desperate to make landfall. That's the map right there. Let's talk about John Smith. In 1606, Smith became involved with the Virginia Company of London's plan to colonize Virginia for profit, and King James had already granted a charter. But during their voyage to Virginia, Smith was charged with mutiny, and Captain Christopher Newport placed him under arrest, and he planned to execute him. However, when they landed at Cape Henry in Virginia on April 26, 1607, in unsealed orders from the Virginia Company that designated Smith as one of the leaders of the new colony, he was released. As the colony starved and began to die off, Smith tried to obtain food from the local Indians, but it required threats of military force for them to comply. And Smith discovered that there were those among both the settlers and the Indians who were planning to take his life, and he was warned about the plan by Pocahontas. So he called a meeting and threatened those who were not working that he that will not work shall not eat. And after that, the situation improved and the settlers worked with more industry. Now, Smith would later claim that he was captured by the Powhatan twice, and that Pocahontas begged her father, who was the sachem of the tribe, to spare his life on both occasions. We don't know if that's true or not. Smith was severely injured by a gunpowder explosion in his canoe, and he sailed to England for treatment in mid-October 1609, and he would never return to Virginia. And in 1614, though, he returned to America, this time in a voyage to the coasts of Maine and Massachusetts Bay. He was given command of the mission and set out in 1614 with 2 whaling ships and 2 subordinate commanders, Captain Michael Cooper and 20-year-old Captain Thomas Hunt. Now, while the 2 ships kept busy fishing off the coast of Maine, Smith took a crew of 8 in a small boat to explore the northeastern coast of America from Maine to as far south as Cape Cod, where he would obtain 11,000 beaver and otter pelts from the natives. He named the region New England, and the commercial purpose was to take whales for fins and oil and to seek out mines of gold or copper. But both of these proved impractical, so the voyage turned to collecting fish and furs to defray the expense. And on his map, which was published in 1616, Cape Cod was called Cape James, an apparent gift to the English monarch. But fortunately, this name did not gain traction, and Bartholomew Gosnold's original name of Cape Cod endured. Now, Indian place names were replaced by the names of English cities at the request of Prince Charles. And the settlers of Plymouth Colony adopted the name that Smith gave to that area, and other place names in the map survive today, such as the Charles River, marked as the River Charles, and Cape Ann, marked as Cape Anna. Now, during this time, as he made his way along the south shore of Massachusetts Bay, he became involved in a fracas with the Quanahasset tribe as he passed by the rocky ledges of modern-day Cohasset. The Indians fired arrows, while Smith's men exchanged musket fire, allegedly killing one native and wounding another in the thigh at Hominy Point or Smith's Rock. Now, Smith collected a ship's cargo worth of, quote, furs, train oil, and corefish, and he returned to England. The expedition's second vessel, however, under the command of Thomas Hunt, stayed behind, and he captured a number of Indians as slaves, including Squanto of the Patuxet tribe. So, when Smith started back to England, he told Hunt to stay behind for a while and pick up from the Indians a load of fish, skins, and other items to bring back. But Hunt went beyond these instructions. He had other plans. He offered to trade beaver, and Hunt lured 27 Nauset and Patuxet Indians aboard his ship, and then he took them captive. Sir Ferdinando Gorges, who was head of the Council for New England, remembered it similarly. Quote, "One Hunt, a worthless fellow of our nation, set out by certain merchants for love of gain, who, not content with the commodity he had by the fish and peaceable trade, he found among the savages, after he had made his dispatch and was ready to set sail, more savage-like than they, seized upon the poor innocent creatures that in confidence of his honesty had put themselves into his hands." He tricked them. Now, Hunt stored the Indians below the hatches, and he sailed them to the Straits of Gibraltar and onto the city of Malaga, Spain, where he sold them as slaves. But when some local Spanish friars in Malaga discovered that they had been brought from America, they took custody of the remaining Indians, and they instructed them in the Christian faith. As Gorges states, the friars so disappointed this unworthy fellow of the hopes of gain he conceived to make by this new and devilish project. Now, among the slaves taken by Hunt was a brave named Squanto. We know him as Squanto. And the Nauset and Patuxet tribes were outraged by the kidnappings, and they became extremely hostile. And after this, English and French ships visiting Plymouth and Cape Cod were no longer welcomed with profitable fur or fish trade offers. In the popular lore of the early English settlers, a crew of Frenchmen were said to have shipwrecked along the Cape Cod coast and taken captive and then enslaved by the Nausets. Their party was taken by the local Nausets, and most of them were executed, but not before evoking a divine curse against their native captors. According to Thomas Morton, in a short time after, the hand of God fell heavily upon the Nausets with such a mortal stroke that they died on heaps as they lay in their houses. The two remaining survivors were ransomed to the English captain Thomas Dermer. Since about the year 1519, European fishing vessels were occasionally seen on the horizon by the natives. For instance, Bartholomew Gosnold was among the first Europeans to make landfall in northern Maine, travel south along the coast to Cape Cod, and observe natives running on shore gawking at the sight of his ship. And he discovered Martha's Vineyard and built a temporary fort on the Elizabeth Islands at Cuttyhunk in the year 1602. Now, the earliest settlers of the Elizabeth Islands were the Wampanoag Native Americans. And the tribe didn't settle permanently on the Elizabeth Islands, but they used them in the summer for hunting, fishing, and gardening. And occasionally, arrowheads or stone tools are discovered on the islands. According to oral tradition and archaeological evidence, the Wampanoags had occupied this area for nearly 10,000 years and consisted of a population of around 12,000 people by the time of the explorer Samuel Champlain's mapping expedition around Plymouth Harbor, which he named Port St. Louis. That's his map. In the foreground, that's Gurnet or Saquishneck, by the way. So John Smith was convinced that Hunt's actions were directed at him. By inflaming the local population, Smith said he could prevent that intent I had to make a plantation there, keeping the country in obscurity so that Hunt and a few merchants could monopolize it. According to Smith, Hunt had taken his maps and notes of the area to defeat Smith's plans of a settlement. He couldn't believe that Hunt was driven by greed, since there was little private gain to be gotten. Hunt sold these little silly savages for rials of 8. Now, Smith made 2 attempts in 1614 and 1615 to return to the same coast, but his ship was demasted by a storm on the first trip, and on the second attempt, he was captured by French pirates off the coast of the Azores. He escaped after weeks of captivity, made his way back to England, where he published an account of his 2 voyages as a description of New England, and he remained in England for the rest of his life. Now, Smith noted that the people inhabiting the coasts from Maine to Cape Cod had large cornfields and great troops of well-proportioned people, and that the French had been so successful in trade with the natives because they came in peace, whereas English merchants came with weapons and arrogance. Now, Smith believed it was too late to reverse this reality, even with diplomacy, and what was needed was military force. And he suggested that English adventurers should rely on his own experience in wars around the world and his experience in New England, where his few men could engage in silly encounters without injury or long-term hostility. He also compared the experience of the Spaniards in determining how many armed men were necessary to effect Indian compliance. So far larger than its title, Smith's book outlined his vision for the New World. He specifically identified the part of the region that became Massachusetts as having all the elements needed for building and sustaining a colony, and it was also ripe for exploitation. Fertile land, timber, springs, fresh water, codfish, and of course, beaver pelts. He identified one specific spot that he claimed had an excellent good harbor, good land, and no want of anything but industrious people. This is the very spot where the Mayflower Pilgrims established Plymouth Colony, a former village known as Patuxet. You can see the Patuxet tribe, part of the Wampanoag Federation, led by Massasoit. So the original inhabitants of Patuxet were Algonquin Indians who apparently used it as a summer resort. The natives would go to the shoreline, the coast in the summer, and then into the interior during the winter. And for at least 3 places along the shore, there were rich in relics indicating such use. In fact, lobsters were abundant at that time, and Joseph Jocelyn, an early visitor, wrote of an Indian lad spearing 30 lobsters from his canoe in an hour and a half. But nothing further has been learned of Captain Thomas Hunt, though it is believed that he was discredited in England for his actions in taking slaves, and thereafter he had difficulty obtaining commissions. But seeing that Patuxet was decimated by disease, it's just me posing this question, could one of Hunt's men been a super spreader 2 years before the supposed epidemic in 1616? So in other words, in 1614, is that when the epidemic broke out? Or did the infected men or man or fur traders, fishermen, or natives travel from the northern Maine coast after infecting the native population there and dock at Patuxet, or did one of the natives carry it with him in the trade routes? And this is what King James said when they came upon these decimated villages where they found them empty, bones, bleached bones, actually on the ground, that these natives had died so quickly they didn't even have time to bury them. Within these late years, there hath by God's visitation reigned a wonderful plague, the utter destruction, devastation, and depopulation of that whole territory, so as there is not left any that do claim or challenge any kind of interest therein. We, in our judgment, are persuaded and satisfied that the appointed time is come in which Almighty God in his great goodness and bounty towards us and our people hath thought fit and determined that those large and goodly territories, deserted as it were by their natural inhabitants, should be possessed and employed by such of our subjects. He thought it was providence, a sign from God. So did the Pilgrims. So about 60,000 Indians lived in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut at the beginning of the 17th century, according to historian Shelburne Cook. Maine had a robust population of Abenaki tribes. According to some estimates, Maine had more than 20,000 Penobscot, Micmac, and Passamaquoddy Indians. Now, the Passamaquoddy were among the first to make contact with the Europeans, and in fact, they were devastated by a typhus epidemic earlier in the year 1586. And the introduction of European diseases to the Wabanaki was devastating. The years from 1616 to 1619 are known as the Great Dying. During this time, a deadly disease swept coastal New England from Cape Cod through Maine. And in Massachusetts, the death rate among native people was as high as 90 to 95%. And among the Wabanaki, even with a more spread out population, their death rate was more like 75%. And the specific agent responsible for this epidemic has not been specifically identified, but it might have been plague, smallpox, or viral hepatitis. It's been categorized as a virgin soil epidemic. However, further north along the Maine coast, where natives had more sustained contact with French traders, some of the earliest reports of disease outbreak were made. In 1616, for instance, Father Pierre Baird, a French Jesuit missionary, noted, "The Abenaki are astonished and often complain that since the French mingle and carry on trade with them, they are dying fast and the population is thinning out." That same year, Captain Richard Vines, an English explorer, wintered on the Maine coast, and he noted that the local natives were sore afflicted with the plague, for that the country was in a manner left void of inhabitants. Now, soon the mysterious disease spread throughout the coastal region, following the trade routes of the Abenaki, who traded furs for corn and other provisions from the tribes to the south, and turned the loose confederation of Algonquian villages that dotted the area into an apocalyptic wasteland. And you can see the settlement trails there. Native Americans didn't possess the necessary immunities to fight off these animal-borne diseases that originated in Europe and Asia. Europeans and Asians had developed antibodies over thousands of years after living with and domesticating chickens, pigs, horses, cattle, sheep, and goats that were not native to Mesoamerica. Thomas Morton offers a vivid account of the landscape left behind. For in a place where many inhabited, there hath been but one left alive, to tell what became of the rest, the living being, as it seems, not able to bury the dead. They were left for the crows, kites, and vermin to prey upon, and the bones and skulls upon their several places of their habitations made such a spectacle after my coming into these parts, it seemed to me a newfound Golgotha. Now, disease continued to ravage the Massachusetts Bay shoreline, wiping out the native populations by the thousands. The epidemic covered an area that spanned from the Kennebec and Penobscot rivers of southern Maine to the Narragansett Bay of Rhode Island, with the highest rate of fatalities concentrated around Boston Harbor and Plymouth Bay. Sailing along the Massachusetts coastline in 1619, Captain Thomas Dermer described the impact on the region, noting that ancient plantations, not long since populous, now lay utterly void. In other places, a remnant remains, but not free of sickness. And how ironic is it that 400 years after a plague swept across Mesoamerica, that here in the United States and around the world for that matter, that we're enduring a pandemic as we speak. Now, Edward Winslow, who acted as an early delegate between the Pilgrims and the surviving Wampanoag tribesmen, described the disease as being not unlike the plague, if not the same. There were certainly symptoms reported that are consistent with plague infection: headache, nosebleeds, subepidermal hemorrhages, and multiple contemporary witnesses noted that the native dwellings were overrun by fleas. However, the case for plague, either bubonic, septicemic, or pneumonic, is unconvincing. For one thing, there were no reports of the telltale buboes, that's swollen lymph nodes, associated with plague affliction. The Algonquian community structure also lacked the necessary population density for a plague virus to spread so rapidly and have such a devastating mortality rate. And finally, the New England climate is unsuitable for the Xenopsila chiopus flea, the known carrier of Yersinia pestis bacterium. Smallpox is another strong candidate, and the reported pockmarks on the victims seem to point in this direction. But critics of this theory note that it was uncommon for adult Europeans who, through generations of exposure, had by this time developed some level of resistance to contract the smallpox virus, and unlikely that the disease would have survived a 6-week sea voyage made by explorers before running its course. Now, large-scale migration of European children would not take place for at least another decade, so the factor which contributed heavily to the confirmed smallpox epidemic that ravaged parts of New England in 1633. Also, in studying the Narragansett language, Roger Williams, founder of the Rhode Island colony, interviewed survivors of both epidemics who made a point of distinction between the 1616 to 1619 plague and the 1633 pox, using two different words in their native tongue to describe two different forms of disease. In his study of the Massachusetts tribe, early colonist Daniel Gookin notes that he discoursed with some old Indians who were in their youth at the time of the epidemic, who said that the bodies all over were exceedingly yellow, and he described it by a yellow garment that he showed me, both before they died and afterwards. This has led to the speculation that perhaps the plague was in fact yellow fever. However, this theory has been largely discounted since the epidemic lasted through the cold New England winters, which would be impossible for a vector-borne disease. Other potential maladies that have been raised by medical historians include hepatitis, meningitis, typhus, chickenpox, trichinosis, influenza, and most recently, leptospirosis. But as of yet, all attempts to identify the nature of the 1616 to 1619 epidemic remain inconclusive. Let's talk about Squanto. He was captured by Thomas Hunt, brought to Spain, sold as a slave. The Spanish friars freed him, tried to convert him to Christianity. Squanto escaped again, this time to England, where he learned how to speak English. He lived with a man named John Slaney, who was the treasurer for a furrier and fish trading region in Newfoundland known as Cooper's or Cupid's Cove. So when the opportunity came for Squanto to travel back to the New World, he jumped on a ship and headed to Newfoundland. And he served as an interpreter at the Newfoundland colony at Cooper's Cove, which was trading fish and fur. And that's what it looked like. Cupid's Cove. Let's go to Thomas Dermer. Mentioned his name a few times already. So while Squanto was in Newfoundland, he encountered a ship's captain by the name of Thomas Dermer. And Dermer had worked with John Smith and perhaps was even on the 1614 mapping expedition in which Squanto had been originally taken. Now, Dermer was employed by the New England Company headed by Sir Ferdinando Gorges, and they still had hopes to profit from the beaver trade with the Indians of Massachusetts. But this would not be possible as long as hostilities still remained. So Dermer recognized that Squanto, who had now been living with Englishmen for a number of years, could act as an interpreter and a peacemaker between the English and the still enraged Indians of Patuxet and Nauset. So in 1619, Captain Dermer and Squanto set off for New England to attempt to make peace and reestablish trade with the Indians and to map out the natural resources that could be exploited by their company. But upon arriving, they discovered Squanto's town and all the Patuxet were dead from the plague. He did make contact with Massasoit, who was 35 at the time. He was the sachem and leader of the Wampanoag Federation, and also along with his brother Quatakina. And they were the heads of the Wampanoag Confederation. In the absence of his own people, he took up residence with them. Now, their plan to make peace was foiled by the fact that Squanto's tribe had been completely wiped out. So Dermer was captured by natives at Namasket, and Squanto came to negotiate his release. He was freed, and Dermer returned to England. Let's talk about Ypres, and he is woven into the story as well. He was a strong, intelligent Wampanoag Indian who lived on Martha's Vineyard, but in 1611, Captain Edward Harlow captured him while exploring the New England coast. Allegedly, Harlow had been commissioned by Sir Ferdinando Gorges to kidnap Indians for slaves while he explored the New World. All told, Harlow brought 30 Indian captives to London, intending to sell them to the Spanish as slaves. Now, Londoners were fascinated by the exotic American Indians brought to England by the explorers, and the captives became sideshow attractions in street carnivals, coffee houses, and taverns. In fact, Shakespeare probably saw Ypres in person and was probably thinking of Ypres when he mentioned a strange Indian in his play Henry VIII. Now, Gorges took Ypres as his own slave, and he housed him with another Indian, Assakummet, who taught him English. And that allowed Ypres to observe Gorges' hopes and dreams and to figure out a way to get back home. So he persuaded Gorges he could show him a gold mine on Martha's Vineyard. And Gorges took the bait, and he commissioned a voyage to Martha's Vineyard with Ypres and one or two Indians along as translators and guides. And also backing the trip was Shakespeare's sponsor, the Earl of Southampton, and a captain by the name of Nicholas Hobson. Now, Gorges didn't completely trust his Indian slave, so he ordered Hobson to guard him closely and to dress him in long clothing so he could be grabbed easily should he try to escape. When Hobson sailed into the harbor at Martha's Vineyard, Ypres' people greeted the vessel peacefully, and Hobson invited them aboard the ship. Once the Wampanoags came on deck, Ypres quietly hatched an escape plan with them. The Indians told Hobson they'd return with trade goods. The next day, the Wampanoags arrived in 20 canoes, but they refused to board the ship. Hobson talked and gestured, but they remained standoffish. So Hobson called Ypres out of the hold to translate. Now, Ypres welcomed his people in English, which they didn't understand. And then he instructed them in his own tongue, which the English didn't understand. And then he tried to lunge off the ship. The crew grabbed hold of him, but he was so big and so strong and heavy that he went overboard. And when he hit the water, the Indians shot arrows at the ship. The English returned fire, killing some of the Indians, but Captain Hobson and the crew were wounded. The ship returned to England without any gold or Indian slaves, and Hobson told Gorges that Ypres had been killed. Not so. So Ypres now had no use for the English from then on, and he became a sachem or leader and led the Indians' resistance to the colonizers. And in 1619, Captain Thomas Dermer came to Martha's Vineyard, and Ypinal visited with him peacefully, and he told him, laughing, about his escape from Hobson. Now, Dermer returned the next year, 1620, shortly before the Pilgrims arrived, and Squanto was aboard. Ypinal's men, not so friendly this time, attacked him and his crew, retook Squanto, and killed all but one of Dermer's crew. Dermer was mortally wounded. He might have been wounded up to 14 times, and he escaped to Virginia, where he eventually died. And Squanto was taken captive by Ypinal, but he was eventually returned to Massasoit. Now back to our story. John Smith lobbied the Pilgrims to take him with them, but the Pilgrims demurred, preferring to take his maps instead of his domineering persona. After all, the Pilgrims would be dependent upon, and at the will of Captain Smith, had he been aboard the Mayflower. And Smith later insisted that had they read his map and listened to him, modern-day Boston would have been the more suitable settlement than Cape Cod or Plymouth. So at daybreak, after 65 days at sea, on November 9th or 19th, depending upon the calendar you use, and after seeing seagulls and the ocean beginning to turn from the color deep blue to a shade of green, they sighted what Smith called on his map Cape James. This long sandy arm had been previously named Cape Cod by explorer Bartholomew Gosnold in 1602. So again, they were heading to the mouth of the Hudson River. You can see Virginia's border went just north of modern-day New York City. And the passengers were delighted to see the autumn colors of the trees and the abundance of them. Now, Jones tried to make his way south to the Hudson, their original destination, but the winds were now against him. His planned route and his actual route. So Weston had originally thought that a more northerly settlement would be conducive to cornering the European market on codfish. Each spring since 1519, hundreds of fishing vessels from England, France, Spain, Portugal, and Holland lurked off the coast of Maine at the Grand Banks, but their legally granted land was 220 miles to the south at the Hudson River. Now you can see the route of the Mayflower along the outer arm of the Cape. The wind had been in their favor as they moved south, but suddenly at 1 p.m., the winds and the tide shifted, and they were now approaching one of the most dangerous shoals in North America, known as Pollock's Rip. And alarmed Jones immediately realized that the destruction of their ship was imminent. Bradford said they fell amongst dangerous shoals and roaring breakers, and they were so far entangled therewith as they conceived themselves in great danger. But with the changing of tide, wind, and current, by 4:35 p.m., Christopher Jones moved the Mayflower northwest of Pollock Rip, and they were out of danger for the time being. And they drifted off the coast of Chatham until dawn on November 10th. At this point, to the alarm of the passengers, Jones made the fateful decision to turn the tip of Cape Cod and anchor in Provincetown Harbor. On November 11th or 21st, 1620, the Mayflower's anchor was dropped in Provincetown Harbor at Long Point. At this point, I'm going to continue to use old-style dates. We'll just add 10 days to bring it forward to our calendar. So you can see where they arrived at Long Point. So of the 102 passengers aboard the Mayflower, 50 were men, 19 women, and 33 young adults and children. Just 41 were true Pilgrims, religious separatists seeking freedom from the Church of England. And there were 25 to 30 crewmen and officers on board the Mayflower. But before anyone was allowed to leave the ship, they wanted to hammer out a formal and binding agreement that we now know today as the Mayflower Compact, which was a primitive constitution of rights for men only. Knowing life without laws could prove catastrophic for the colony, colonist leaders created the Mayflower Compact to ensure a functioning social structure would prevail and preserve the right to worship as they wished. On November 11, 1620, 41 adult male colonists, including 2 indentured servants, signed the Mayflower Compact, although it wasn't called it at the time, and 9 men abstained. Women were not allowed to sign it. The Mayflower Compact was a short document which established that the colonists would remain loyal subjects to King James despite their need for self-governance. The colonists would create and enact laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices for the good of the colony and abide by those laws. The colonists would create one society and work together to further it. The colonists would live in accordance with the Christian faith, and the Mayflower Compact was important because it was the first document to establish self-government in the New World. And it remained active until 1691, when Plymouth Colony became part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. In the name of God, amen. We, whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign, Lord King James, by the grace of God, of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith, etc. Having undertaken, for the glory of God and advancements of the Christian faith and the honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents, solemnly and mutually, in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience. In witness whereof, we have hereunto subscribed our names at Cape Cod, the 11th of November, in the year of the reign of our sovereign Lord King James of England, France, and Ireland, the 18th, and of Scotland, the 54th, 1620. Now Bradford, reflecting on that first morning in America with wonder, said, "But here I cannot stay and make a pause and stand half amazed at this poor people's present condition." In the next 4 months, half of them would be dead. On November 6th, William Button had died while on board the Mayflower. Ellen Moore also died of illness while on board the Mayflower. Susanna White gave birth to Peregrine White while she was on board the Mayflower in Cape Cod Harbor sometime in late November. Now let's look at the first landing. The Mayflower anchors on November 11th, and quoting Bradford, "Thus arrived at a good harbor, they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven." Now they wanted to explore the land. They had a 35-foot shallop in the hold of the Mayflower, but it had to be reassembled and repaired, and that would take several days. So they used one of the two ship's boats, which were 21 feet in length, and they were rowboats, and instead they sent 16 men ashore. So on November 11th, 1620, which was a Saturday, the Pilgrims briefly came ashore on land that is now in Provincetown on Cape Cod. The booklet Mort's Relation, written mostly by Edward Winslow, who would become the third governor of Plymouth Colony, shows a map of where the first steps in the land were supposed to have taken place. The landing place is commemorated with a plaque in a small park located in the middle of the rotary at the end of Commercial Street in Provincetown. And appropriately, it's called Pilgrim's First Landing Park. So there you see it. There. So the Pilgrims immediately realized that the sandy tip of the cape was unsuitable for a permanent settlement and that they had to find a better location on the bay side of the shoreline. And Bradford said they fell upon their knees and blessed the God of heaven, who had brought them over the vast and furious ocean and delivered them from all the perils and miseries thereof, again to set their feet on the firm and stable earth, their proper element. And they retired back to the ship before nightfall, bringing aboard badly needed firewood. And they remained on the Mayflower the following day, which was a Sunday, to pray on the Sabbath. But when Monday the 13th came around, limited passengers were allowed to go ashore to bathe and to wash their clothes. And after that, Monday would become a traditional wash day in New England for generations afterwards. So, now the first landing. It's November 15th, and Captain Miles Standish and a party explore as far as the Pamet River, and they see Indians who run away and spend the night ashore. So this is an overland expedition. So they send an overland exploratory party down the sandy dunes of Cape Cod for 3 days, right there, beginning in Provincetown. So they saw whales in the harbor, and they wished that they had whaling harpoons. Ashore, they saw birds and geese. Bradford says the greatest store of fowl we ever saw. So Standish had the men in their light armor march in single file, and they marched about a mile when they saw 6 men or so, along with a dog, staring at them down the beach. They whistled for their dog, and then the men scampered into the woods. The Pilgrims pursued them, but lagged behind them. They were bogged down by their breastplates and their weak legs from being at sea for so long. And they pursued them for 7 miles before deciding to camp for the night. And they built a fire, they posted sentinels, and picked up the chase at first light on the 16th. And at 10 a.m., they came into a valley and saw their first deer, but their chainmail and breastplates were torn to pieces by the brush. Now, they were desperately thirsty, with only a crude alcoholic beverage to sustain them. They came upon a small hill, and there they found a freshwater spring. And to quote Bradford, "They drunk our first New England water with as much delight as ever we drink in all our lives." Today, the area is known as Pilgrim Spring. Now, they were going to build it for a second night, and they made camp. They lit another campfire, this one larger, as a signal to the Mayflower that they were okay. On the morning of Friday the 17th, they found abandoned stubbled cornfields, and they also stumbled upon what appeared to be a Native American grave. Bradford said it would be odious unto the Indians if we ransacked their sepulchres. Then they came across evidence that they were not the first Europeans to come into the area. They found sawed-off planks and an iron kettle. Remember, they didn't have iron here for the Native Americans. They didn't even have the wheel. Next, they came upon the salty, tidal Pamet River. There they found remnants of a fort that may have been built by explorer Martin Pring, who in 1603 captained an expedition in North America to assess commercial potential. He explored areas of present-day Maine, New Hampshire, and Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And on a high seaside hill, they found mounds that were unlike the grave that they had examined earlier. In it, they found reed baskets filled with multicolored corn, which we know as maize, and the Nauset tribe stored their seed corn and grain for the winter months there. And starving, they filled a large kettle full of this corn and made a commitment to compensate the owners at a later date. I call this the first act of American credit. Today, this area is referred to as Corn Hill. There's a plaque there at the base of the hill and on top of the hill, the actual spot where they found the corn. By dusk that evening of the 17th, it was now raining, and they became lost in the woods, and William Bradford became entangled in an Indian animal snare. Finally, they met a landing party headed by John Carver and Christopher Jones at the shore, and they were taken back to the ship. So on Monday the 27th, they decided to send the reassembled shallop, again with the 16 men, south along the inner cape to a place they would name Cold Harbor. But they would add 18 additional men to bring the count to 34, and it was led by the captain of the Mayflower, Christopher Jones. You can just see they just travel inside the arm. Now, the winds were against them, and it blew them into an inlet in what is now called Pilgrim Lake, and that's where they decided to spend the night. And plus their shoes and clothing were turning to ice. Bradford would later recall, quote, "Some of our people that are dead took the original of their death here." Caught pneumonia. And this is the second landing where they got seed to plant them corn the next year. By the morning of Tuesday the 28th, they were frostbitten, as 6 inches of snow had fallen overnight, and they decided to remain in Cold Harbor. Jones wanted to get back to the ship as they were in knee-deep snow and cold. So that evening, they camped by another fire and feasted on duck and geese. The next morning, the 29th, they went back to Corn Hill, but they couldn't find it because it was obscured by snow cover. They finally found it and located more stores of corn. And Jones, along with some invalid men, took the corn back to the shallop, and they sailed back to the Mayflower. Standish, though, stayed behind with 18 men, and he struck up camp again. Jones was to pick them up the following day, Thursday, November 30th. That morning, Standish began to search for the indigenous people, but they were nowhere to be found. Standish found another grave site, but this time he decided to desecrate it. There they found the remains of what seemed to have been a European with yellow hair, including a sailor's sack, a knife, and a sewing needle. And next to him lay a child with a tiny wooden bow. Later that day, they found recently abandoned wigwams. They took articles at their pleasing and left nothing in return. So looting and ransacking graves, corn stores, and villages would not endear them to the native inhabitants. And they were picked up by the shallop that evening. Now they now understood that Pamet was not a proper place to settle. One of their pilots, Robert Coppin, vaguely recalled from a fishing expedition years earlier that there was a protected harbor with a river about 20 miles or so across the bay. And he called it Thievish Harbor because the natives had stolen his company's harpoons. He's talking about Plymouth. So on Wednesday, December 6th, they set out on their third expedition, this time with John Clark and Robert Coffin leading. Jones chose to remain behind on the Mayflower. And amongst the 16 men this time were Bradford, Standish, Winslow, Howland, Carver, and Hopkins. They would explore the harbors of the bay side of Cape Cod. So they sailed 15 miles down the coast, and now their coats were frozen by salt spray. And they observed Indians hacking away on a beached whale carcass, and the natives scrambled away when they glimpsed the shallop. So the Pilgrims set up camp and lit a fire, and then they noticed a column of smoke 4 miles away. On the morning of the 7th, they continued to look for a settlement site as a landing party was dispatched from the shallop. They came across more graves and another abandoned village. By nightfall, they set up camp once again. And now the landing at Nauset, December 8th, 1620. Early on the morning of December 8th, following a long day of exploration and foraging, and an even longer night pierced by the hideous and great cry of what seemed to be a company of wolves or such like wild beasts, an exploring party of Englishmen was confronted by another great and strange cry, which they knew to be the same voices they heard the previous night. This time, however, a returning scout exclaimed that the voices were not beasts, but men, Indians, Indians. His warning arrived only moments before a flurry of arrows flew through the barricaded Mayflower shore party, and they screamed, and 4 Pilgrims returned musket fire, though none found its target. And then the landing party decided to return to the Mayflower. Then came the 4th landing. They went to Clark's Island, where they spent 2 nights. So they scouted Cape Cod for a settlement site, found none, and settled for Plymouth Harbor and a deserted Patuxet village. A landing party set out for the shore, and near Clark's Island, the wind snapped the shallop's mast and broke the rudder. A seaman brought the boat to shore where it was repaired. And freezing there, they prayed Psalms 61 and 100 at a place called Pulpit Rock, or Election Rock, and then they returned to the ship. That, my friends, is the true Plymouth Rock on Clark's Island. And then the 5th landing was December 11th at Plymouth from the shallop. They had actually found a settlement site. On December 11th, 1620, the men landed on Plymouth Harbor Beach and secured the boat to a glacial rock in the harbor. Now, the legend of Plymouth Rock, it's a 200-ton boulder of Dedham granite, the only Dedham granite in the area. And since then, it's been cut in half, bombed, dropped twice, and trimmed to fit its present-day portico in Plymouth Harbor. Once the Pilgrims had come ashore, they had established the land on which they would build on, and they made their plans for a permanent settlement. They had decided that the houses would be close together and near the fields that were already cleared by the Patuxets. On top of the highest hill, they would erect the fort, but a violent storm delayed building, and it wasn't until January 2nd that the trees were felled and construction began. In less than a week, the common house was erected, and after that, families started to build their own homes. Now, Governor John Carver permitted families to stay on board the Mayflower, and the Pilgrims lived out of the Mayflower and ferried back and forth to land to build their storehouses and living houses. And they labored all throughout the winter months of December, January, and February, and they didn't start moving entirely ashore until March. But food supplies had dwindled, and being townspeople, they had little experience in hunting or fishing, but they did kill a few fowl to survive. And now Governor Carver rationed 5 kernels of Indian corn to each person once a day. Hunger and malnutrition led to disease, predominantly scurvy and pneumonia, and eventually death. 8 Pilgrims died in January, 17 in February, 13 in March. And the Pilgrims would bury their dead at night in unmarked graves because they did not want the Native Americans to know how many had died fearing attack. And then when these people were gravely ill, they'd prop them up against a tree and put a musket in their hands as if to fool the Native Americans that they were sentinels. So when spring arrived, only 57 pilgrims and half the crew had survived. 17 were children, and the remaining families returned to their damp homes, which they abandoned for the relative safety of the Mayflower in the winter months. On March 17th, they planted English herbs, vegetables, peas, wheat, and barley, but the wheat the pilgrims brought with them would not grow in the rocky and acidic New England soil. They harvested reeds from the marshes to thatch their roofs, and they scouted for Indians. Among the military men and Commander Miles Standish, he had been shot at by Indians on Cape Cod, and he had yet to meet these terrible savages. Now, the men of Plymouth Colony would continue to re-elect Miles Standish to that position for the remainder of his life as commander of the military. And Bradford and Standish were frequently preoccupied with the complex task of reacting to threats against both the Pilgrims and the Pokanokets from tribes such as the Massachusetts and the Narragansett. A defining characteristic of Standish's military leadership was his proclivity for preemptive action, which resulted in at least 2 attacks or small skirmishes on different groups of Native Americans, which were called the Nemasket Raid and the Wessagusset Massacre. Anyways, the Mayflower left on April 5th, 1621, and the citizens of Plymouth, hungry now, threadbare, thin, watched the Mayflower set sail from Plymouth to return to England, and not one of them asked to return. So these terrible savages had been watching the Pilgrims from the safety of the surrounding woods, learning everything they could about the settlers. Their experience with white men had made them cautious and suspicious. Later in the spring, Samoset, now Massasoit's ambassador, came into Plymouth after observing the Pilgrims. He and Squanto had been surprised to return to their abandoned village after the winter and find that there were Englishmen living there. So Samoset was the first Native American to make contact with the Pilgrims. And on March 16, 1621, he startled the settlers when he walked into their village and greeted them in English, which he had learned from English fishermen. He was a member of a Wampanoag tribe that resided in Maine, and he was a sagamore or subordinate chief, and he was visiting Massasoit at the time. With a hand raised in friendship, Samoset greeted the Pilgrims and said, "Welcome, Englishmen." And then he asked them if they had any beer. The Pilgrims were astonished. He was friendly, dignified, he spoke their language, but they were cautious. And he spent that night with the Pilgrims on board the Mayflower, as they were suspicious. So Samoset departed the plantation the following morning, and a week later he came back with Squanto and the leader Massasoit. Now Squanto spoke much better English than Samoset. And for the next few days, Squanto acted as an interpreter, while John Carver, now the governor of Plymouth, and Massasoit hammered out a peace treaty that would last for more than 50 years. They would become very good friends. But after March 22nd, 1621, Samoset disappears from the records and nothing more has been learned about him. Likely he went back to Maine. That's my theory. Well, Squanto. Well, he now came into the village, and after this first hard winter, he helped the Pilgrims by teaching them how to cultivate maize, how to catch fish, eels, and other local wildlife for food. And in the summer of 1621, while on a mission for Governor Bradford, Squanto was captured by the Wampanoag while gathering intelligence on the renegade chief known as Corbitant in the village of Nemasket, which is present-day Middleborough. And Miles Standish led a 10-man team known as the Nemasket Raid to rescue Squanto, and he was found alive and well, and he continued in his vital role as assistant to the colony. Now, Massasoit, known as Osamoquin, he was the sachem or leader of the Pokanoket and a leader of the Wampanoag Confederacy, and the term Massasoit means great sachem. He was born in today's area of Warren and Bristol, Rhode Island, the Pokanokets. He was the one who was the go-between in the meetings. And Massasoit negotiated a treaty with the Pilgrims in exchange for their alliance against the Narragansett. Massasoit would sell lands to the English. He was honest, humane. He never violated his word. And he constantly endeavored to imbue his people with love and peace. He was a great man, a great leader. So that's my presentation tonight, Journey Through the Past. The Pilgrims 400 years after. Again, ironic that 400 years ago, when the Pilgrims came to the New World, they saw a land that had been decimated by plague and epidemics, And ironically, 400 years later, that's where we are today. Thank you so much for all of the folks on SAM watching me today, and also at the folks at the Southborough Council on Aging. I'm John Horrigan. Thanks for watching. Take care.